everybody, and welcome to today's webinar as part of UK Radon Awareness Week 2020. This is being run by the UK Radon Association, who represent members involved in radon testing and mitigation and advice, consultancy and radiation protection across the UK. Today's webinar is focusing on radon in property transactions, whether you're buying or selling a property yourself, or you're acting for somebody who might be buying or selling a property in a radon affected area. We're going to run through all the important things that you or your client needs to know and consider. Radon Awareness Week is aimed at, as it says on the tin, raising awareness amongst people who don't currently know an awful lot about radon. And the web page on the UCRA website that receives by far and away the most hits is the page on advice for people buying or selling property. So I'm delighted we've got so many people joining us today to find out more about this and spread awareness. A couple of practicalities about the software we're using today. On the right hand side of your screen, you'll see you've got a chat box. Do use that, say hello to us so we know who's there, who we've got on the line, and have any discussion amongst yourselves if you want to. If you've got a specific question that you would like answering at the end of the session, if you scroll down to underneath the main presentation screen, you'll see a separate box for questions. If you could post any specific questions in there, it will mean that I can pick them up easily at the end and answer them without them getting lost in the chat. So without further ado, let's get going. Quick introduction to who I am. My name's Rebecca Coates and I'm the current chair of UCRA. I'm also head of radon projects at PropertyCo, who are a founder member of UCRA, and we carry out radon testing and mitigation and so forth across the country. In both roles, we do find that a lot of our inquiries do come as a result of conveyancing property transactions. It's quite often the point in time that most people, general members of the public, find out about radon. So that's why we wanted to host this webinar today, to try and spread some more information, accurate information about what people need to know. So we're going to start with the very basic question of what is radon? In a nutshell, it's a radioactive gas that comes from the ground. Beneath us, in all the rocks and soils everywhere in the world, there are tiny deposits of uranium. Uranium is radioactive. When it decays, it becomes radium, which is another solid. It's a shiny silver metal. In years gone by, it was used for its fluorescent properties, helpfully used in watch dials and airplanes and things like that, because it was luminous, fluorescent, and people could see it. It was then, however, discovered it was highly radioactive and therefore not a good thing to be exposing ourselves to. So you won't see it used very much anymore. When radium decays, it decays into a gas, which is what radon is. Unfortunately, radon is not a large yellow plume of gas, as I've shown in this picture here. Only way I could illustrate gas for a webinar, it has no colour, no taste or no smell. You will have no idea how much is coming out of the ground in any given location unless you've done a specific test for it. It is completely imperceptible. Radon does come out of the ground constantly in different parts of the country in varying concentrations, and unfortunately it can therefore accumulate in buildings. In the past, radon was talked about as being a naturally occurring gas rather than a man-made gas, for example, like other contaminants. Yes, radon is naturally occurring, as in it comes from the natural decomposition of uranium deposits that are naturally present. However, when it's being trapped inside a building, that therefore becomes a man-made problem. Someone has put the building there and put people inside that building, and it's only a problem when radon is trapped inside the building. People often think if something's natural, it can't hurt you. Yes, radon can. If you're outside in the fresh air, it's not hurting you because it will be a very low concentration. But if it's accumulating in the building, then yes, unfortunately, it can. Our bodies are exposed to all sorts of things that can damage our DNA and our cells. I've borrowed these slides from a good friend of the UK Radon Association, Professor Aaron Gaddazi, who's a professor of genome damage, specifically focusing on radon damage over in Canada. Ionizing radiation is one of the causes of DNA damage, and that is what radon is. What does that mean? What's it doing to our cells? Professor Goodarzi would explain this much better than I can, but in layman's terms, we all have 2 chromosomes in our cells. Sometimes they can get damaged, they break apart, and normally they're pretty good at repairing themselves, putting themselves back together. However, sometimes the repairs are done wrongly, and the sections don't quite match up properly. The more damage we have, the more chance of errors we have. That then leads to genetic mutations, which can in turn lead to cancerous cells forming. And these pictures on the bottom show you picture A is a nice, healthy, normal cell with 2 pairs of chromosomes, all nice and neatly lined up. Picture B is unfortunately a cancer cell, where you can see something has gone very wrong. And for whatever reason, the cell's been exposed to harmful damage. The chromosomes are mismatched, too many in certain parts, and therefore that's how tumours can be formed. Radon exposure can and does lead to lung cancer. We're breathing in the particles of dust that will have radioactive particles from radon attached to it. It is actually the decay product of radon that causes the damage, but we just refer to radon as a whole for simplicity. When we inhale those particles, they're in our lungs and potentially emitting radiation and causing that DNA damage. Radon has been linked with over 1,100 deaths in the UK every year from lung cancer. Those are estimates that have come from pooled international studies on extrapolating data from exposure and the result that has on people's cells. In Europe, that accounts for 9% of all deaths from lung cancer, which is 2% of all deaths from all sorts of cancer in Europe can be linked back to radon exposure. The risk is higher for smokers or ex-smokers because there is a synergistic effect of the damage you're having from tobacco smoking and radon exposure. However, if you're a non-smoker, radon remains your biggest risk of lung cancer. And it is obviously avoidable. We don't have to live or work in buildings with high levels of radon, which is why it's so important that people are aware and they can do something about it. Just to put those risks into perspective, these are all causes of deaths, statistics that I got from the ONS for the last year or so, estimated figures for radon, but actual figures for number of deaths from homes, fires in the home, and carbon monoxide poisoning cases. In the UK each year, sadly, we have still around about 50 cases carbon monoxide poisoning causing death, and somewhere around about high 300s to 400 deaths from fire-related incidents in the home. We all know how important it is to have a carbon monoxide alarm and to have our boiler serviced regularly. We know that we should have a smoke alarm and check the batteries and what to do if there was a fire. Statistically, though, people are much more likely to be affected by radon in the home than they are from either fire or carbon monoxide. But how many people have actually tested their home for radon? That's what we need to change. Especially at the moment, whilst we're in the midst of a global pandemic, where the primary damage that is being done to people is through their lungs. We've only got 1 pair of lungs. We need to look after our lungs, prevent any damage that we can to make ourselves as resilient as possible to things like coronavirus that may attack us in the future. So now more than ever, we need to be testing homes for radon, finding high levels and doing something about it. What counts as a high level of radon? At what point should you or your clients be taking action to reduce the level? Outside in the UK, average radon levels are about 4 becquerels. So in the UK, we measure radon in a unit called becquerels, expressed as becquerels per cubic meter of air. If you're ever looking on the internet, something about radon, and you find something mentioning picocuries or PCI per litre, you are on an American website. They use a different unit of measurement. So I suggest you close that website and find something based in the UK to refer to, because the levels are completely different. But outside in the fresh air, we have about 4 becquerels of radon. In the average UK home, anywhere in the country, the radon level is about 20 becquerels. The government advises us in the UK that the action level for homes is 200 becquerels, so 10 times the national average. If your radon level is above 200 becquerels, you should take action to reduce that level. Since 2010, we've also had a target level advised, which is 100 becquerels, so half the residential action level. And it's advised that if you are in a higher risk group, so if you're a smoker or an ex-smoker, you should strongly consider taking action if your level is over 100 becquerels. And if you do take any mitigation action, the target level is the aim to get below. So rather than starting at, say, 300 becquerels and being happy that you might have got it to 199, where possible, you should be aiming to reduce levels to below 100 becquerels. There is no such thing as a safe level of radon, just that the lower the level you're exposed to, the lower your risk. We do advise clients with levels over 100 always to strongly consider taking action, whether they currently are in a higher risk group or not. Who's to know in the future whether you become classified as a higher risk person? Also, in due course, the residential action level may be reduced to 100 becquerels. The World Health Organization advised that countries set their action level at 100 becquerels where possible. In Canada, the action level is 100, and in America, it's the equivalent of 150 becquerels. So at some point in the future, the action level may come down to 100 in line with the target level. So to protect future asset value potentially and your health, we would always recommend if it's over 100 becquerels, you should consider doing something about it. Where are you most likely to find radon? Some of you might be familiar with these maps that are produced by Public Health England and the British Geological Survey, and these maps estimate the probability of finding high levels of radon in any given area. So they are based on the 200 becquerel action level. It's worth pointing out that if the action level, if these were based on the target level, there would be approximately 500% more properties that would then become classified as in radon affected areas than there currently are. So much more of the map would be shaded than it currently is if the action level was brought down to 100. The darker the colour on the map, the greater the probability is that the property will have over 200 becquerels of radon. It doesn't necessarily tell you that you're more likely to have a much higher level. It's just the frequency you're likely to find those properties rather than what the actual level is going to be. And these maps, of course, cannot tell you whether any individual property is affected or not. They are purely a guide as to where you're most likely to find high levels. The darker the colour, the greater the risk. We certainly have tested properties in white areas and found, which is less than 1% risk, and found them to have high levels. Sometimes that's because there is a basement or cellar, but not always. Basements and cellars automatically mean that the property is at increased risk. The gas is coming from the ground. So if you have a basement, you've got up to maybe 5 times the surface area in contact with the ground through which the gas can permeate. And you've also got the increased dynamics that cause radon to be drawn into the property coming into play when you've got a basement. So if your client has a property with a basement, you shouldn't be referring to this map to see if it's in an affected area. You should be proceeding as if it is an affected area, regardless of where it is in the country. There aren't many other risks that we measure on percentage chance of whether we're happy to have it in our home or not. If someone said, oh, you're going to buy this house and there's a 1 to 3% chance that it might have a major electrical fault that might spark a fire, you probably think, oh, I want to investigate that. It either does or it doesn't. So with radon, we would recommend always carry out a test, regardless of what the map says. You want to know what your house that you and your family are going to spend time in, what the radon level in there is, rather than an estimate that may or may not actually apply to your specific house. Those maps and the data from those feed into the data set that the answer on the CON29 form 313 radon gas, that question asks, is the property in a radon affected area? And the answer will come back something along the lines of, yes, it's in a 1 to 3% risk band, no, it's in a less than 1% risk, or it's in a higher risk band. It's important that you and your clients understand that this is a risk band, not a percentage of radon. We do quite often have people ringing and say, I've been told my property has 3 to 5% of radon in it. No, it's a 3 to 5% probability that it will have more than 200 becquerels of radon, which I know is confusing, but we try and explain it as simply as we can on the UCRA webpage. Do remember with this report, though, this report doesn't know whether there's a basement or a cellar at the property. So always flag that up to your clients. If there's a basement or cellar, it should be dealt with as if it's in a higher risk radon band. You'll then be doing your environmental searches. Radon is obviously mentioned in those. I've got a couple from some of the more popular providers. One here from Groundshaw on their Avista report. Radon is mentioned. It says that there could be harmful effects from radon for the inhabitants, and it then gives which percentage band it's in and some further details and contact details of who the client could contact for further information, which is likely to be Public Health England or the UK Radon Association. We and our members are always happy to advise people in the process of buying a house what they should do next. Another report from Landmark, their Risk View Residential report deals with radon underground hazards, and again it will say which percentage band it's in and where further advice can be obtained. The property information form TA6 that the vendor completes asks specific questions about radon. So firstly, 7.4, has a radon test been carried out in the property? And if so, yes, what were the levels and was anything done? We would always recommend, if your client or you are putting a property on the market, if you know you are in a radon affected area, then advise they have a test before they put it on the market or as soon as it goes on the market, so they have the results back and they can head off any potential delays at a later stage when a potential purchaser starts asking these questions and realizes that maybe it should have had a test. And we're going to come on to testing and how that's carried out a little bit later. But yeah, we would recommend, if you're going to have to declare that the property is in a radon affected area, get it tested as soon as possible. Chances are there won't be a problem. You'll have a certificate from a laboratory saying that the radon level is low, and therefore it doesn't become an issue at a later point. Question 7.5 is a bit ambiguous, but it's really aimed at new constructions. Was any radon protection installed at the time of construction? The building regulations do now require radon protection to be installed in new buildings, and they have for some time. There are a separate set of maps that construction companies have to refer to decide what level of protection they install. There are three different colours on the map. There's white areas where no radon protection is needed. In light grey areas, basic protection is needed, which is a radon membrane. I'm going to show you some details, pictures of these in a minute. And in the dark grey areas, full protection is needed, which is a membrane as well as either a standby sump system or a ventilated suspended floor, which I'm going to show you some details of in a minute. So this is what the map looks like, 3 different colours on there. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite correspond with the Public Health England maps, which are the maps that you will be doing your searches for. So for new builds, new construction and extensions, radon protection is only required in the 3% plus risk areas, so the 3 to 5% band and higher. That, however, leaves the 1 to 3% band, as we've got here in this map. This is replicated all across the country, but I've just chosen this area near Evesham, Stratford upon Avon. As you can see, there are the light yellow colours there, which are on the PHE map, which are classified as a 1 to 3% risk. So they are a radon affected area. If you were to buy a new build in that area, though, it wouldn't have been built with any radon protection in at all. So it's an important question to ask the builders, and to always still test. Even if you're buying a new property, don't assume that it's protected, and if it is protected, that the protection is actually effective. I'm going to show you a picture of that in just a second. So this is what basic protection should look like in a new build property. It's a gas-proof membrane across the whole footprint of the property. All penetrations should be sealed and be gas tight, ideally have been heat welded. This, unfortunately, is what sometimes occurs on new build sites. That's not going to be gas tight. The builder could say, yes, we've put a radon barrier in. Clearly, that's not going to be effective. So do not assume that a new property must be okay and I don't need to test it. We have got a webinar tomorrow specifically on radon protection in new builds. Some of you might also be interested in joining if you haven't already signed up for that, where we're going to be talking about all of this, the process of verifying new protection, when it should be tested. All of that's going to be covered tomorrow. Full protection in a new property, which is in the higher risk areas, involves the membrane as well as either a ventilated suspended floor or a standby sump system, which is a series of sump boxes, which are voids that could be used to ventilate the property in future, to collect the gas and exhaust it at a point in the future if it's found to be necessary. They will be normally capped off, like the picture on the bottom right here, capped off so they can be brought into use and activated by adding a fan at some point in the future if it's needed. You only know if you need to do that if you've tested, so it's important to test. It's also vitally important that you know where this capped off pipework is, what it's for, and where it is if you need to use it. So if a client's buying a new build property and it's meant to have full protection in, always get it noted where this is, so someone doesn't come and landscape over it, put a new path down a patio, or connect a drain to it, something like that. You must know where that is in case you need to use it. So how do you go about finding out if your actual house or the house you're looking to buy is affected? You can look at the maps, you can get an idea, you can find out if it's got protection in, but unless you've tested, you don't know how much radon is in that property. There are various ways of testing. We have passive detectors, or now digital detectors as well. So the passive detectors are the two. You see here they look like black domes or discs, and then we've got various digital ones. By far the most common way of testing, particularly in conveyancing, is with the passive detectors. All they do is they're left in property for a period of time. The gas moves through, or any air moves through the detector. It's then sent back to a laboratory, opened up, and there's a special sheet of plastic inside, which is sensitive to radiation. Any radiation will have made tiny little indentations on that lens. Those are then effectively counted up under a very powerful microscope by the lab to determine how much radon it's been exposed to. The digital monitors are more commonly used if you know you've had a problem and for ongoing testing, or if you've got lots of properties that you want to test, have your own kit to then reset and move between properties. How long do you need to test for? Radon levels do unfortunately fluctuate constantly. Day to day, week to week, even hour to hour, you could have a different measurement. We typically have higher levels, almost twice as high in the middle of winter than we do in the middle of summer in the UK. So for that reason, it is impossible to get a meaningful result in a quick test that someone might come to a house for other things and do a survey. You might book someone to look at the damp or the timber in the property. You can't book someone to just come along, do a quick survey for radon and determine whether you've got a problem or not. So you do need to test for a longer period of time. We can do a screening test, which takes as little as 10 days with the detectors in situ. Usually for a standard sized domestic property, you would use 2 detectors, place one in a ground floor living room and one in a first floor bedroom. They must be left in place for 10 days and then returned to the lab for analysis. So Although we call it a 10-day test, it's still, by the time the detectors have been posted or placed by a surveyor, collected, returned to the lab, analysed, and the results issued, it's likely to be almost 3-week process in all. So it can't be something that at the last second before exchange, someone says, oh, can we just quickly do this? It still will take a couple of weeks to do. The results from the screening test will give you an indication as to whether there's likely to be a problem or not. Sometimes they may be inconclusive. If they come back with a mid-level, it's impossible to determine what the annual average level would be from that, but they should flag whether you've either got a very high level or a very low level. But we'd always recommend doing follow-up testing with a full 3-month test when possible. These sorts of detectors, the short-term tests can be obtained from various UK Radon Association members. Longer-term tests, Public Health England do sell, as well as our members. You'll find that our members often have very good rates for these, usually cost between £40 and £50 for a pair of detectors, including the lab analysis, and the results are normally returned within a week of having the detectors back. The 10-day test is a snapshot. However, to get an accurate result for the property, it's much better to carry out a test over a 3-month period. This allows various fluctuations to be taken into account, and we can also apply a seasonal correction factor to take account of the time of year that the test is being carried out. Most people don't want to hold up a property sale for 3 months though, and if the testing hasn't been started well in advance, it's then therefore not possible to do a 3-month test before exchange. So that's when the radon bond system can come into play. This is a retention that would be agreed between the vendor and the buyer to allow for that testing to be carried out after completion. A certain amount of money should be retained by one of the solicitors whilst the test is carried out. Once the results are back, that money is either then used to pay for the remedial works if required, or goes back to the vendor if there is no problem. So the 3 things you need to consider for the bond are how much money goes into it, what's the time limit on using it, and what's the trigger level when it comes into play. So the value first, we would, as the UK Radon Association, we would recommend £2,500 as a sensible sum to have in the bond. That will cover most scenarios for most properties. You can agree less if you want to, but the person purchasing the property may well then have to top up the amount if it does need any mitigation. The time limit, we'd recommend 6 months from the point of completion. That gives time for somebody to move in, order the detectors, have them arrive, put them in place for 3 months, have them analysed, get them back, and if necessary, get quotes for the work and get the work booked in to then be paid for. There's no point having it as a 3 months time limit because it's unlikely someone will have the results and be able to act on them before that then limit expires. The trigger level is an interesting one, and it's likely to be contentious between the buyer and the seller of the property. We would recommend, if you were buying a property, always try and ask for it to be 100 becquerels. Certainly if I was buying a property and I wanted to live there, I would want the radon level to be less than 100 becquerels. But 100 is the target level, and 200, as I said, is the current action level. If the test results come back showing that mitigation is needed, if the results are over 100 becquerels or 200 becquerels, what does that look like? What does it involve? Some people get worried that, oh, I don't want to buy this lovely house if potentially we're going to have to rip all the floors up and destroy it doing radon mitigation works. That is not the case. Radon mitigation works are fairly non-intrusive, mainly done from outside. So a radon sump system, which is the picture on the left here, is creating a small void beneath the property to become the low point of pressure, which is where the gas will be attracted towards. It can then be vented safely away through pipework to vent safely away from any opening doors or windows, which is usually above the eaves of the property. That has an inline fan in and would be constantly running. The typical cost for installing a single one of those usually between about £1,200 to £1,500. Unfortunately, it does attract VAT, so remember that. They are very effective. Properties, large properties or properties that have been extended, however, may need more than one sump system, which is why the recommendation is for £2,500 in the bond. A positive pressure system is changing the pressure differential between inside the property and the ground. Gas is drawn into the property because we have lower air pressure inside than outside. If we can raise the pressure in the property, it inhibits the gas from being drawn inside. So these units typically will go in the loft if there is one available, draw clean air in, extra air in through the natural ventilation in the loft, force it through the unit. They will filter it, warm it slightly if necessary, and it comes out of a diffuser on the landing ceiling. Typical cost for installing one of them may be around about £1,000 plus VAT. Side benefit of these is they can also help with other air quality issues such as condensation and high humidity levels. People often say once they've had one of these installed for radon, oh, it feels so much healthier now, the air. It's not because you've lowered the radon level, that's imperceptible, but if the relative humidity is lower, generally the air is better for breathing and people have better respiratory health. Particularly tip here if you've got asthma sufferers, often triggered by allergies to house dust mites. If you have one of these units installed, tends to make house dust mites inviable. They won't survive and you'll reduce your house dust mite population and reduce that allergy trigger. So there are side benefits to having a positive pressure system installed for radon, not just reduce the impact of radon, but other air quality issues it can help with as well. So final question is that we get asked, should I buy the house? It's in a radon affected area. Should I buy it? Yes. If you like everything else about the house, go ahead and buy the house. That's what I would do. But I would always get it tested before. I would get it tested whether it's in a radon affected area or not. I'd want to know what I'm going to be living in for the next few years or potentially many years. Always recommend getting it tested, and if high levels are identified, carry out mitigation work. Don't ignore it, but don't let it be something that stops you buying a house that you like otherwise. So that brings me to the end. I can see we've got quite a few questions here to get through, so I'll crack on with those. I know there's some discussion going on in the chat panel as well, which I haven't been able to monitor so closely, but I'll start with the questions in the question panel. If anyone wants to put a question that they put in the chat over to the questions to make sure I see it, please do. So first question here, Alan says, I'm purchasing a house built in 1978. It's in an area where elevated radon levels are detected in 1 to 3% of properties. Advice, please. Test it. I would suggest arranging a radon bond with the vendors and carry out a full 3-month test after completion, depending how far along you are. I would do that now. Get your solicitors to put in a clause, a radon bond clause, range of retention, suggested for £2,500, but they won't agree to that much, whatever you can get them to agree to, and then you can carry out the test once you're in situ. It is better to test when you are there rather than someone else, because they might have different occupational habits that you might. They may be people who like to live with the windows wide open all the time and no heating on, which could be completely different to you, who you might have the heating turned up full and no windows open, which would mean your radon level inside would be higher than theirs would be. So it's best to test under the conditions you know you're going to be living in. So I hope that answers that one. Property form TA6 is an English one. I'm afraid, I believe there would be similar forms in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. It's not something I know off the top of my head, Bob, but I can find the answer to that. I can put comments back on this once the replay comes live. So I will check that. I will type in the comments, and when you come back to the replay, you should get an email for that later on today. Hopefully I'll put a comment in there and then you'll be able to check there. So apologies, don't know that off the top of my head today. Someone in the chat may be able to, may be more familiar than I Question from Laura about digital detectors. Can they give reliable results in shorter times? Is it still accepted as a check on a seller document? So the digital monitors will start reading as soon as they are in place. However, and they are, some of them say they take about 7 days to calibrate, do their internal calculations to come up with a reliable reading. After that time, they are reliably reading what the radon level is at that point in time within a certain margin of error. But the issue is that radon levels can fluctuate hugely from day to day. So yes, it might be accurate in terms of this is what the radon level is on that day, but that could be misrepresentative of what the long-term radon level is. And we're interested in long-term exposures with radon. It's not an acute problem, it's a long-term chronic problem over a number of years. So there's no point potentially just picking up a peak that might happen in 1 week or a low point in the next week. We need to know the long-term average, which is why longer-term testing is really important. Question here on mapping from Chris. Is there a map showing the number of people suffering from illnesses arising from radon, and does it strongly correlate with the radon map? So it's lung cancer that's linked to radon. Unfortunately, we still have by far and away the largest number of lung cancer cases are linked with smoking. Smoking prevalence changes across the UK. So any maps showing lung cancer cases are highly weighted by the smoking prevalence of the local population. Therefore, it's not really possible to filter just which ones have been caused by radon. So unfortunately, we can't combine the maps, but the effects of radon are well established, well documented, well researched. It is classified as a class 1 carcinogen by the World Health Organization. Everyone agrees that radon exposure, long-term exposure to elevated levels of radon, does lead to an increased risk of lung cancer. Okay, another question from Chris. Is there any system to allow a community to rent radon centrally rather than each house? Interesting point. This does happen in parts of Europe, in parts of Scandinavia. I've seen case studies of radon wells, which is a very large radon sump in the middle of a close or a cul-de-sac venting. It is possible to do. The running costs would be higher of that, but then would have to be split between the residents, which could come into all sorts of disagreements over who wants to pay a proportion of that or not. The maintenance of it, when somebody buys or sells a property, it adds an extra complication. So it's not something that we've seen in the UK and not that we've had any great demand for. It's worth pointing out that radon doesn't necessarily affect each house the same. You can have a row of terraces. One may have a very high level, the rest might be very negligible levels. Some of them might have high levels, some of them might have zero. Practically, just because houses are close geographically and all in a radon affected area doesn't mean that their radon level will be the same or even similar. It all depends on the local geology underneath even that particular plot. What's going on, what pathways the gas is taking. If there's something like an old capped off well, that could cause the gas to migrate towards that area and then find its way into the building, whichever building is above or closest to that. If there's a large fissure in the rocks, that opens up a nice pathway and that could funnel the gas straight into one property rather than another. So unfortunately, in a neighbourhood, it might not be the case that all properties have a similar radon level. So not everyone might want to contribute towards a community mitigation system. Question here on bonds. 2,500 bonds is to cover, no, so the 2,500 bond would cover the mitigation. The testing is almost always paid for by the purchaser, as they would pay for any other surveys or investigations that they're having done pre-purchase. They would normally pay for the radon testing if it hasn't already been carried out. As I said, that's normally about £50 or less you'll find at the moment. If you do want to test for radon, several of our members for Radon Awareness Week are selling radon test kits at approximately half that price. So if you haven't tested your house and this has piqued your interest, now would be a good time to order a test kit because you'll get one about as cheap as you ever will at the moment if you just search for it. So the testing is cheap relatively. That would be a cost that the buyer would pay. The £2,500 bond would cover most scenarios for mitigation. If it's a very large property, if it's got basements or cellars, you might want to try and agree more than £2,500. But typically we find that would cover most scenarios. Another question from Chris on trees. Not something that I believe has been researched or anything I particularly know the answer to. I don't think trees would have any effect on dissipating radon. When the gas comes out of the ground in fresh air outside, it's quickly diluted to a very low concentration. Even if you had a plume of it coming out of the ground somewhere out of a mine, it quickly dilutes in the fresh air to low levels. As I said, it's about 4 becquerels in the open air. And so vegetation things don't really have an impact on outdoor radon levels. Question from Martin here on testing. Why would you test the first floor of a property on a short-term test if the gas is coming from the ground? You don't test every room of that house initially. We would normally advise test a ground floor room and a first floor room. In almost all properties, almost all instances, you would have higher levels in the ground floor than the first floor, but occasionally we have found higher levels upstairs than downstairs. If there's certain airflows in the property, someone might have an air conditioning system that might be impacting the gas. In new build properties, we've had issues where the ground floor has been pretty well protected with a membrane, but the detailing around the stack pipes and drain pipes in the corners hasn't been quite perfect, and we've found issues where in a first floor bathroom we've had huge levels coming up there with hardly anything at ground floor, and that's because the gas has been funneled up through the boxing in the house from where it hasn't been properly protected with the membrane, and therefore it's releasing out where there's a vent in the bathroom upstairs. So it's always worth, we say, if you've got a 2-story house, testing ground floor and first floor as well. Okay, I think that's got through all the questions that were posted in the question box. I know there's some more discussion in the chat. I'll just give you another couple of seconds if anyone wants to put anything else in the question box that might have been missed. But otherwise, I'll assume that you've discussed amongst yourselves in that box on the right there. I hope you found today's session useful and interesting. The Radon Association is here as a resource. We're happy to advise you or your clients on any issues to do with radon, as are our members. You can connect with us on LinkedIn, follow us on Twitter. My email address is there. I'm always happy to receive questions and help you out if you've got anything you or your clients need advice on. So thank you for joining us. As I said, we have got another session tomorrow on radon protection for new builds. If that's something that you get involved with a lot, you might find that useful. A replay to this a link will be emailed to you later on today. That's valid for 5 days, but then in due course it will be uploaded to the Radon Week website as well. That's all from me. Thank you very much for listening and for joining in, for all your chat and your questions. Hope you all have a great day.